tonight. Maybe not. There's a lot in it. And it's called The Courage of Your Convictions Part 2. And we've looked at what it means to have that courage, to go against the values, the opposition, the culture of the day. And we've travelled with Esther as to see how she asked for prayer as she approached her husband unannounced, and what that meant, and how he gave grace and favour to grant an audience, and how she invited him to dinner and everything else. And we left it with, the king says, I'll give you whatever you want. And she didn't tell him exactly what was on her mind, whereas you and I probably would. And I think we pick it up at a proposed courtesy in these verses 6 through 8. As they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, now what are you asking for? I'll give it to you. What is it you want? I'll give you as much as half of my kingdom. Esther answered, this is what I want and what I ask for. My king, if you are pleased with me and it pleases you, give me what I ask for and do what I want. Come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet and I'll prepare you for you. Then I'll answer your questions about what I want. So she's inviting him to another feast. So as we break it down, it's the proposition that we have. As they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, what are you asking for? I'll give it to you. What is it you want? I'll give you as much as half of my kingdom. Now, this is the second time that Xerxes has offered his proposition to Esther. And basically he's saying, what is it you want? I'll do everything with my power to give you what you want. Just tell me what you want. Now, Xerxes hadn't forgotten why Esther she approached him in the first place. He knew that it was something that was bothering her. He knew there was something she believed he needed to know. Something that she thought he could do to solve the problem. Now this time Xerxes makes the promise in the presence of Haman. And I can understand Esther's reluctance to be able to come out with what she knows at this time, because Haman didn't get to where he was because of his niceness or his kindness or his compassion or his courtesy. He was a ruthless public servant. He was on the way up. He got to number 2, and he was going to make sure that he stayed in number 2 position. So it's enough to make you say, well, I'm not going to spill the beans when he's in my presence, because he might do something about it. And so basically we have her inviting her husband. It's interesting. She's inviting her husband to tea again, and she does so. And so we then move to the promotion. Esther answered, this is what I want and what I'll ask for. My king, if you are pleased with me and if it pleases you, give me what I ask for and do what I want. Come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I'll prepare for you. Then I'll answer your question about what I want. So she just sticks to the line. Just come to dinner. Now, if it was you and I, we would probably say, well, this is what I want. What are you going to do about it? But she didn't take that opportunity. You'll notice how she approaches to the king. If this is what you wish. Now, he had to look good. He didn't want to lose face. So she approached it the right way. If this is what you wish. If you really want it and are pleased with the idea, come to another banquet. In other words, come to dinner with your wife again. Maybe Esther felt she needed more time before she presented a case to the king. But unbeknownst to Esther, God's handprints were all over everything that was happening, even to the timing of this second banquet the next day. And that challenges us. We cannot get too far ahead of yourself. My mother always used to say, you're putting the cart before the horse. That expression? In other words, you're getting too far ahead of yourself. You have the horses and you put them to the cart and they'll function. But you can't put the cart in front of the horses and expect them to function. So don't get too far ahead of yourself. God has everything under control. And the things are working out in his time scale, not everybody else's. And he's doing what he wants with Haman and the king. Now, you may question it, but you can't beat God's timing. He always delivers right on time. It might be close, it might be to the last second, but he always delivers just in time. And I believe that's why Esther restrained from opening herself right up. She didn't tell Xerxes the whole truth about Haman and his intentions. God was delaying this great exposure about Haman until he throws, if you like, another spike into Haman's wheel of fortune when the king would honour Mordecai, which he's going to do in the next chapter. We need to understand that God was at play here, because people like Xerxes do not like to be told what to do, and they don't like to wait. That's just a fact of life with Xerxes. He was a busy man. He had many things that required his time and attention. And with this request, what she's asking, it would mean that Xerxes would have to put off meetings and cancel whatever plans he has in order, if you like, to clear his schedule so that he can have tea with his wife. Add to this, Esther had time on her side. She would delay. None of her attendants, or for that matter, other palace officials, were aware of her ancestry at this time. If they were, the walls have ears, and Haman would have been informed and taken action to negate any plans that she might have had to interfere with what he had planned on. Palace politics were dangerous, and if you had information, it could be used for your profit or your demise. And so if Haman got hold of this information, which he was probably willing to pay for, then it meant he could take care of any would-be successors coming up behind him. The primary concern that we have in these verses 9 through 11, Haman left the king's palace that day. He was happy and contented. And why wouldn't you? You just had a feast. And, you know, when you've had a good meal, what do you want to do afterwards? That's what happens when you get older. You want to sleep. Siesta time. You're contented. You are satisfied. But as he's going home, guess who he saw in the front gate? The king's gate. And it says he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, saw that Mordecai didn't stand up or tremble with fear before him. And so Haman became very angry with Mordecai. But he controlled his anger and went home. Then Haman called together his friends and his wife Zeresh. He told them how wealthy he was, how many sons he had. He also told them all the ways the king had honoured him and how the king had placed him higher than his important men and royal officers. So here we have the proposition. Haman left the king's palace that day happy and contented. Now, what is a presupposition? I just want a simple answer, but that's pretty good. You've memorised that. But a presupposition is something you assume to be true so that you can continue in what you're saying or thinking. Haman left the palace happy, in a contented mood. Why wouldn't he? He just had a meal with the king and queen. That was as good as it gets. As far as he was concerned, life was fantastic. He was looking forward to a bright future. He couldn't see any problems popping up and interfering and destroying him. He'd taken all the proper precautions, tidying up all the loose ends, or so he thought. What could possibly go wrong? He was on top of the world, the second most powerful man in all the Persian kingdom. His influence and power was growing day by day, and he was somebody of note and power. He was not somebody you mess with if you could get away. He had access to unlimited resources. There was nothing he believed could stop his progress of future prosperity, and now he's reveling in having a second invitation to lunch with the king and queen. In his own mind, and that's where a lot of our thinking does happen, in our own minds, he had arrived. This invitation would only cement his position in the kingdom. So he looked forward to this further invitation to promote himself in such illustrious company. His presupposition was only in his imagination. In fact, it was bordering on arrogance, and it's not going to be long before he's brought crashing back to earth with an earth-shattering dose of reality. How quickly things can change. But when it's all in here, life's good. It really is, till somebody comes along and mucks it up. And he's had a great day. And then we have what I call the petulance. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, saw that Mordecai didn't stand up or tremble with fear before him, Haman became very angry with Mordecai. Now, isn't it true that when you're having a wonderful day, it only takes one person to stuff it up? Just one person come along and you forget about the rest of the day because they happen to stuff it right up for you. Just one person. And this person, this day, happened to be Mordecai. All he could see was red. The arrogance, the rudeness of Mordecai. How dare he? He's not respecting me. He's not even recognizing who I am and the position and power I have. His insolence knows no bounds, and he does it to me day in and day out. And I don't like it. Haman's petulance for recognition spoiled his day. All his feelings of being on top of the world and powerful evaporated in 1 second when he saw Mordecai. He was totally consumed by bitterness to this man who failed to give him his due recognition. Gone was a wonderful time at the king's banquet. All the great food, the company, the possibilities of the future, they no longer occupied his thinking. He was raging inside like a bull. He wanted to destroy Mordecai on the spot. Here you have the second most powerful man in the Persian kingdom who was able to control most things. He was a person who had his finger on the pie of everything that was happening. And yet, one man he couldn't control. His feelings, he couldn't make him do or comply to what he wanted. And it irked him. And he was trying desperately to find a way of getting rid of him, make an example of him before others followed him. So he had to make an example of him, put him in his place. His hatred became a driving force that consumed him. It clouded everything he did. He was obsessed, he's bitter at just one person. Isn't it interesting? You've got all the power, you've got all the resources, and one person can just make you forget everything. And this is what happened. He felt he was superior, and so he's going to take steps to make sure people knew and understood the power and influence he had over them. And he realised that this is something people needed to pay attention to. He was somebody you didn't mess with. He was somebody to be reckoned with. The perception, but he controlled his anger and went home. To his credit, Haman brought his temper under control. He didn't get to the place where he was going to take foolish risks and destroy everything he'd worked up to. So he wisely refrained from acting against Mordecai in public. And you know what? Public perception is everything to a progressive politician. They don't want you to see what is happening. They don't want you to see how they really feel. And that's why the saying goes, there's nothing to see here, everything is fine. And we've seen that in our news things. We've been told what the problem is, and our politicians, nothing to see here, everything's fine, trust me. That's a consummate politician. So instead of acting in the heat of the moment, he walked away from what he really wanted to do. He had inside information, and that information was he'd signed a decree with the king's name on it that was going to get rid of all the Jews, and Mordecai would be one of them. So he was satisfied to a point. The day of reckoning for Mordecai was coming. He knew it. It probably didn't help that Mordecai sat in the king's gate, which according to Persian law protected all those who sat there. So you see the problem? Here is the second most powerful man. Here is Mordecai sitting in the king's outer courtyard or the gate, and he's protected. So if Haman laid a hand on him, the king would have known all about it, and he would have been called to give an account. So wisely, he didn't attack him. He didn't say anything. He just walked away. And so he'd come up with this other plan that would satisfy his desire to get rid of him. And the pretensions. Oops. Then Haman called together his friends and his wife Zeresh. He told them how wealthy he was, how many sons he had, told them all the ways the king had honoured him and how the king had placed him higher than his important men and his royal officers. Now the best way to deal with someone who, if you like, puts a burr under your saddle, in other words, rattles your cage, shakes your day up, makes it worse, is to have all your friends and family come over and then remind them just how good you are. Remind them of all the things that you have done. That's the problem with insecurity. When you compare yourself with others, when you feel you're superior to others, you've got to resort to reminding yourself and others how wealthy you are, how you have a position of power and influence over the very elite in society, and how you advise the king on policies that are beneficial to you and your friends. You have all these grandiose feelings of importance. After all, didn't the king promote you to this position? And he wouldn't have done that if he didn't think you were someone of importance or somebody that wasn't worthy of it. Now, understanding the Persian way of life was to gain the approval and acceptance of your peers. It all came down to about keeping up appearances. And in this case, Haman wanted his friends and family to know they were in the presence of a very important person in Persian society, and they needed to hear. They needed to know. You must have wonderful friends if that's all you've got to put up with, and that's all you can tell them about how good you are. Oops. The progressive conception. He also said, I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to come with the king to the banquet she gave. And tomorrow also the queen asked me to be her guest with the king. But all this does not really make me happy when I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Then Haman's wife Zeresh and all his friends said, have a 75-foot platform built, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it, then go to the banquet with the king and be happy. Haman liked the suggestion, so he ordered the platform to be built. Why not? Good suggestion. Kill all the birds in one process. The presumption. He also said, I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to come with the king to the banquet she gave, and tomorrow also the queen asked me to be her guest with the king. Here we have a man who has no problem in blowing his own trumpet. He'd convinced himself he was so important that the queen invited him alone, no one else, to share a meal with the king. She must think an awful lot of him. Not only that, but she must have been so impressed by his company, she invited him back for another banquet. Life was really good. He was presumptuous enough to think that the king and queen were providing this banquet to honour him and recognise his contributions to the Persian kingdom. I mean, why else would the king invite him alone to such an event if it wasn't about him and what he's done? That's presumptuous thinking. Haman was so consumed with his own sense of importance, he failed to consider this banquet could also and would also lead to his demise. He would sign his own death warrant by his interactions with the Queen in this second banquet. As far as Haman was concerned, the sky was the limit for his future progress. He had big plans. He wanted to advance. He hadn't considered there was any way he could be stopped or hindered. And this is what happens when God is left out of the equation. He reminds people who is really in control of situations and events. Haman hadn't factored in that God would intervene on behalf of the Jewish people, but he's about to get a good lesson and a dose of reality. Oops, the provocation. But all this does not really make me happy when I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Now, to be the second most powerful man in the Persian Empire should have been enough. But he wasn't satisfied with what he had. And there are so many people in the world that are never satisfied with what they've got. They always want more. And he was not satisfied with what he had or what he'd accomplished when he looked at Mordecai sitting in the king's gate. You know, it's like a rag to a bull. He was not happy. He forgot. He'd convinced himself that all he achieved was worthless until he got rid of this one fella. One fella. It's hard to think how one person could cause so much misery considering all that he'd done and all that he had. Yet Haman was not allowing himself to be contented with what he had. So strong was his hatred for Mordecai, it became the driving force in his life. It ate him up on the inside. He was determined this man who disrespected him was going to pay with his life. That would be the only thing that would quench this burning rage in his heart. This was even though he had everything a person could possibly want or desire in life. He had it all. It wasn't enough for Haman. And this is a tactic that the enemy uses to keep people discontented with what they have before driving them towards unrealistic expectations that will never ever satisfy them. Now I just want to say a word here with this, the presentation. Then Haman's wife Zeresh and all his friends said there's a 75-foot platform built, and in the morning asked the king to have Mordecai hanged on it, then go to the banquet with the king and be happy. Now it always disturbs me a little bit when you read in scripture that it's not just the bloke, it's his whole family that gets destroyed. And you think, is that really fair? But here in this presentation, guess who one of the architects and the eggers on, as I call them, is his own wife. She's on the same page. You know, and let's face it, it's always hard when you've got someone banging on about their own achievements and how good they are, and what he has, and when he can't get what he wants, in this case Mordecai, he's like a little child and chucks a temper tantrum, expressing his dissatisfaction at someone who he considers as stopping him from going any further. So what are you supposed to do? In this case, Haman's wife and friends, if you like, took the bull by the horns. They had enough of listening to his complaints, so they became an affirmative action group. Help Haman get over his pity party. That's their scheme. And it seems that his wife Zeresh and his friends are on the same page with Haman regarding this perceived antagonism towards Mordecai. They had no problem making suggestions how to get rid of an innocent man. How they came up with building the gallows to hang him, I don't know. Maybe that was the way that the crowds entertained themselves in the courtyard. I don't know. One commentator makes this point, though, regarding the gallows. The gallows are not what we think of in our modern culture. In our minds, we think of the gallows that were used in the 1800s and early 1900s to hang those sentenced to death. Here, this refers to a pole that would be erected and the guilty person would be impaled upon that pole. It was to be 75 feet high so that all could see, adding to the horror and cruelty towards the Jews. So it's not what we perceive of this idea of, noose around your head and hang and swinging in the breeze. No, there's this 75-foot pole and you were on it until you died. Can you imagine the excruciation and pain and cruelty? But this is what it's referring to according to historians. Now we find the pride. Haman liked the suggestion, so he ordered the platform to be built. So here he's having his pity party, he's chucked his tantrum, and so he liked the idea. He thought, wow, what a great idea. I'll do that. He's determined he would go to the king in the morning, get the approval, then go on and enjoy the banquet and get his rewards. Knowing I got rid of my pain in the backside. He's gone. That's what he thought. I guess it tickled his fancy. And so he has no hesitation to order the construction of the gallows to be built. He had the power, he had the authority to do this because of his position in the king's service. So no doubt he went to bed that night feeling real good. He'd come up with a surefire plan. It was guaranteed to work in getting rid of Mordecai. Problem is, life doesn't always work out with what you think is going to work for you. And because of Haman's readiness and willingness to build a gallows, it never entered his little mind that those very same gallows he would build would be the ones that he himself would die upon. Never entered his mind. Many people feel good about their lives. They live and what they're doing. They see no wrong. They see no consequences that their actions will bring. And we see that in society. People are doing whatever they want and there's no consequences, so they feel that they're fine. The Bible says in Proverbs 16:25, there is a way that seems right to man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Haman sought to eradicate all the Jews from the Persian kingdom, driven by prejudice and hate for the Jews, which would ultimately lead to his death and demise. This chapter shows us the courage, shows us the conviction of Esther and Mordecai to take a stand, to do some positive action to make sure their people would be heard. And I guess the challenge for us as believers today, do we have the courage of our convictions? Are we prepared to die for what we believe if the occasion arose? Will we stand up against the authorities, knowing that it might cost us our families, it might cost us our friends, it might cost us everything we own? Would we be willing to stand up for the truth? We read it and think, wow, but there's a cost. There's a tension, there's a pressure. And when you take a stand, particularly in the days in which we live, where we have a culture that wants to cancel you out because you speak out about it, they will do everything to make sure that you disappear. That is what Haman wanted Mordecai to happen. And we might be asked to take a stand. Are we prepared to stand on what we believe, even if it costs us? As we close, we're going to stand and sing a